I was saying before commercials that I disagree a little bit with your point of view. I think Chancellor Merkel didn't do enough because their interests with Russia were quite obvious. Buying 45 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia made Germany, I think, weaker than it could have been in the relation with Russia in approaching it, at least on Ukraine issue. I saw that NATO took quite a while to tackle seriously the crisis in Russia. I would say even criticizing even not you, because you are not in the government anymore, but even in the United States, because it took a year to react seriously, and I saw Mr. Breedlove's declarations, which I admire Mr. Breedlove actually. He is one of my heroes in this crisis because he warned your state and Europe a year ago that Putin will not stop. My question to you so is this unity you are talking about is just coming up now more, because before let's say 1 month or 2 months ago, looking to the crisis in Ukraine, we saw diplomatic declarations, we saw statements, we saw these sanctions, economic sanctions, which affected Russia, but it didn't stop Putin going farther and farther in Ukraine.
Well, I think any objective observer, if you could somehow remove yourself from the specific actions on the ground, and looking in from, I don't know, perhaps somewhere above the planet in orbit at the steps that Russia has taken, at its policies, I think objectively you would look at the results and have to say, this is a set of failed policies. And the reason is, in part, because of the united front on sanctions. Obviously, the sharp decline in oil prices had a big impact on the Russian economy, as it's had on some other economies which are dependent on their energy exports. But that plus the sanctions regime have had a very significant impact on the Russian economy. So you're looking at the ruble having fallen almost as much in percentage terms as the hryvnia in Ukraine. The degree to which the Russians, to sustain the ruble where it is and to sustain some of their economic indicators, they've had to draw on their reserves to the extent that it's not a sustainable approach on their part. So those impacts should give, remains to be seen whether it happens, but should give that small circle of people in the Kremlin who are driving Russia's current policies in this crisis in Ukraine, to give them some pause. I agree with you. I think that the response, both from the United States and European Union, could have been stronger, faster, and it's been important to have voices on both sides of the Atlantic who've been raising the alarm. You know the expression. It's been a wake-up call. And this is another thing that should give Moscow pause, because after many years where people made happy assumptions about the nature of the NATO alliance, where people wondered, let's face it, you heard the same talk too, people wondered, you know, how important is that alliance now? No one has many doubts anymore.
Exactly.
People also in the European Union who were filled with self-doubt saw those demonstrators on the Maidan Nezalezhnosti in Ukraine and saw that the soft power appeal, the appeal of the European model, was still very strong, notwithstanding all the internal self-doubt that people in Europe feel. And for Ukrainians themselves, this whole experience has solidified their commitment to Ukrainian statehood.
Some of them because, Mr. Taplin, in the meanwhile, Russia took Crimea, in the meantime took Donetsk, Lubansk, and other cities in Crimea, in Ukraine, with a high cost. And I always, when I have an ambassador usually, but you are you are more than you have been acting ambassadors.
I'm a mere chargé d'affaires.
Yes, you are a chargé d'affaires here and in France, and that's an ambassador position in actions, not as a title. Still, I'm questioning them, and I go to back to them saying, yes, but people died. And we have the biggest humanitarian crisis from the Second World War. And of course, what remained from Ukraine is united. But Mr. Breedlove, I'm happy he did that, said yesterday, we must take in consideration. I'm just asking if you agree with that or how you see it. We must take in consideration supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine, not only talks and discussions.
Right. Well, I know General Breedlove, and I have a lot of respect for him as well. So that's another thing that we agree on.
Yes.
And I work with him closely when I was in France on different issues. But I think my answer is a bit different, just a bit different, because I think that the most important things that we have to do are to provide everything we possibly can to help Ukraine stabilize its economy. I think that is one of the most important, if not the most important, goal and challenge we have. Because the current IMF package is very important. It's an enormous amount of money, but it may not be enough. And as a policy response, in response to what I think are Russia's real objectives, which are to undermine this Ukrainian government and to bring it down and to destabilize it as quickly as possible, the economic dimension is as important as anything else. Secondly, I think the diplomatic unity and the common effort between the U.S. and Europe is of vital value. And so the question, I'm in a sense neither for nor against the provision of defensive arms to Ukraine. I think as an issue it's been a bit overrated, in part because of it's become a matter of public debate for months now. It's one, just as General Breedlove said, in my view, it's one of a number of things that you have to have under active consideration. But it needs to be done at the right time. The timing part, and I think that's what was of concern to President Obama from what I saw. The question of the timing is also vital. Don't take that step if Moscow is going to use it somehow to undermine Allied unity. It's not as important in the end, for the moment at least, it's not as important as the question of going even beyond what we've offered to Ukraine in economic assistance to get the economic situation right, or to make sure that we stay together on sanctions, because the sanctions are hurting. They're hurting Russia, and they're making it increasingly difficult for President Putin and that circle of Kremlin advisors to manage this crisis.
My feeling that I know you are right, but because almost 75 billion euros left Russia in the first months of having these sanctions being applied. But still, I think Mr. Putin doesn't give 2 pennies on this, because his determination to go farther and farther with the army was so much clear, and his messages are so clear now, that my feeling is, of course, and this, of course, that's why we are agreeing to disagree, is that the Ukraine as a country, what left of Ukraine, needs real support, and this means economic but also military, because they cannot fight with the Russian army, and in Ukraine is Russian army. Is no
no, there's no doubt about
Martians,
that. Right.
Is no Martians, a real Russian army, and fighting with the Russian army is not easy. But let me ask you something else, Mr. Taplin. How do you see the difference, or not the difference? What is now? How do you appreciate this declaration of Mr. Bush, and how evolved the relation or the vision of Washington regarding this region, starting from that declaration to today and tomorrow? He declared when he visited Bucharest in 2002 that Romania, before accession, that Romania can be a bridge between America and Russia, and can be, let's say, an area that can be the neutral area, if I quote correctly, between Washington and Moscow. What happened? I mean, what happened from that moment to now, and what happens from now to tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm not sure about this notion of a bridge to Russia. And I'm not sure I was ever a believer in that particular concept, whoever was articulating that.
Me neither, yeah.
I mean, I think that the view in Washington, which has grown stronger and stronger as our partnership has gotten stronger and stronger, and I remember directly the period when I was here, but I also, have been following things since, and I know that the partnership in all of these areas has developed even further and become closer. I think the view in Washington and the view elsewhere from the NATO perspective is that Romania, along with Poland, are the two key countries in this part of Europe. You're the two principal pillars of Euro-Atlantic security. You're the two significant players in terms of population, your economic potential. Yeah, there's a lot more that can be done, but the fact of the matter is the two key countries in the region, one on the northern side of the eastern flank and the other on the southern side, are Romania and Poland. And it's not so much in the context of a bridge, even though, frankly, I think Romanian diplomacy, we've been celebrating the 135th anniversary of U.S.-Romanian relations, and I've done a little bit more research. Romanian diplomacy has always been very effective at keeping channels of communication and dialogue going. So you should continue to promote dialogue wherever you can. But I think the principal importance right now for Romania is to be this linchpin in European security and Euro-Atlantic security in the face of unfortunately, a Russia that seems intent on trying to break the rules that we probably unwisely had started to assume would hold indefinitely. So the alliance and Romania's place in the alliance is vital.
Mr. Ambassador Meyer, in the last interview, the one I understand you also saw, and I'm very happy you did that, he mentioned something very important, and he was very blunt, and I appreciate very much Mr. Meyer as his mind and his work. And he mentioned few things which I will provoke you with, because my feeling is that I agree with most of the things you're saying, but I disagree that we did enough for the region, US and Europe. He mentioned that the KGB, the secret services of Russia, have a larger budget than in the time of the Cold War, while some European states, he didn't mention the United States of course, but some big European states didn't increase or investing enough in this area. As also he mentioned informing our partners, and Romania did its job together with Poland and the United Kingdom to inform you and to inform NATO, to inform the European partners about the plans of Mr. Putin and his plans to advance, and the response of Mr. Let's say the response of Mr. Meyer was to the realpolitik of Russia must create a new realpolitik of Europe and NATO or the United States. From this, I understand that you know it could have been done more, and you were warned, and everybody had the information.
Yeah, well, I think that without knowing myself specifically what analysis,
of course,
and George Mayor is one of the most impressive people I've had the chance to work with, not just in Romania, but more generally. As a general rule, our allies, Romania included, that are closer to Russia, that are more realistic and have to, from one month to another, track developments there, have a more acute understanding, quite frankly, than some of your Western European partners who have the luxury of being further away and making happy assumptions. And sometimes distracted leadership in Washington, and from President Obama on down, there are a lot of problems that you're confronted with. And that's why I said earlier, it's been a wake-up call. But I think that's another demonstration of some of the weakness in this Russian approach, because frankly, taking things to a much more direct confrontation. At one point, a few months ago, I think, I remember one observer was commenting that if you took the number of little green men and other people, separatists, Russians, maybe there were some Martians there as well, if you took all of that together, it was in effect the fourth or fifth largest armed force on the European continent.
That's true.
And so by being as obvious and as directly confrontational as the Kremlin was, for all of their emphasis on ostensibly through subterfuge taking these actions, when you annex a significant part of another country's territory,
Crimea,
and you occupy in what turned out to be a bloody conflict with some terrible humanitarian consequences,
huge ones.
You're going to wake people up, and you're going to wake them up quickly. And I think the alliance now is taking the steps, the partners are taking the steps now that they need to make sure there's no confusion in Moscow. Whatever the decisions are, there can't be any confusion about what the terms of reference are for NATO membership.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a testament to Romania's efforts to make the hard decisions, to take the actions, to join the alliance, that Article 5 and the other relevant provisions of the NATO Charter and being a NATO member, that there's no confusion in Moscow about that.
Let me be very blunt. Was
Yeah.
Putin ignored by Washington and European capitals? Because he declared when he took the power, he said, "I want to." You are an expert in Russia. You worked at the embassy in Russia. You were the director for Ukraine and in this area. You remember he declared officially. He said, "I want to recreate the Petru Mare, the Peter the Great empire." Now, I mean, he never hid his intentions. How we see the reaction of the western part of the world to what he was planning? Mr. Mayer, again, I quote him because I admire him a lot, and he was very blunt yesterday, the day before yesterday, Saturday.
Right.
He told very clear, Putin acted systematically and over years. We had the impression it's a war now, and the things are happening now. But he said no. These were things happening in years. So that's why my question, very blunt to is, were other concerns to the big capitals, or what happened with preventing what Mr. Putin did?
Well, I think my view is that there was no master plan. To use a phrase which unfortunately resonates from the 1930s in an unfortunate way. There are echoes. There are echoes of the 30s. Yeah. And that is a reason that we should be concerned. But I don't think there was a master plan. Did President Putin, and then Prime Minister Putin, and then President Putin,
and again Prime Minister,
right? Did he feel that Russian interests were not taken into account enough by the alliance and by Western countries that might have been partners? I'm sure that's exactly the way he felt. And there were a series of things historically going back at a minimum to the Kosovo experience, the way NATO expansion was carried out. There's a whole critique, and not all of it is wrong. But with Romanians, along with most Eastern Europeans, when the subject about NATO expansion comes up, I haven't found too much opposition, and recently even less opposition, to the notion that expanding membership of NATO was, I mean, how many people in Romania think it was a bad idea? Right now, maybe not.
Most of them believe it's a good idea.
Right. And I think that's true with most of the other NATO members. In each and every instance, were Moscow's views taken into account as fully as they might have been? I don't know. But I think that the expectations that President Putin might have had were probably never very realistic, because his view of the world was so alien
and very
in
limited,
the end.
if you may. I would add that as my point of view, very limited, because he sees still the world in the eyes of the Second World War.
Some analysts believe, and I think these are people who are knowledgeable about Russia, that actually you have someone who tactically is clever, but that is improvising, and may have found a place where it's going to be difficult to improvise away from. We're hoping, all of us, I think, that whether it's through the Minsk process, we'll have to see. I'm not that optimistic myself.
I'm not at all.
But whether it's through that process or some other means, that the Russian leadership decides to take a step back and to de-escalate. But we have to certainly be prepared and be realistic that we could, for instance, be facing the largest of the frozen conflicts.
Absolutely. You are referring to Ukraine, of course. Let me ask you a question, which is, let's say, having direct relation with you and your past. You have been the chargé d'affaires of the embassy in Paris. and that means just for the citizens, because chargé d'affaires, it's an old. You should in diplomacy you should change these titles, saying acting ambassador or something for people to.
Well, the French don't want us to change chargé d'affaires.
Well,
their language used to be the language of diplomacy, so
true.
we should not change too much.
That's true.
Maybe they will speak
too. Maybe they will speak Russian soon if they will continue on this line with Russia. Maybe they will speak Russian, not French. But my question to you, I'm joking, of course. My question to you is: you had the experience in 2013, 2014 in Russia, so it's recent experience. What happened? In France.
Mm-hmm.
What happened with France? France was one of the founding fathers of the European Union. France was one of the founding fathers of the political project of the European Union. And suddenly, France became an ally of Russia, prepared to provide with Mistral Navy weapons, and making business with Russia, and being extremely cautious with the Ukraine crisis, participating to the Minsk peace but not talking at all. More Ms. Merkel was trying to negotiate, having a debt to Russia of 20 billion euros. So how was this possible? You are there, you are, let's say, the acting ambassador in France. What happened with France?
Yeah, well, let me say something about the Minsk process first, just as a private observation, then I'll talk about France and the period I was there. As a private observation, I felt that the Minsk process could have very much used a third European voice. And if you remember that rather dramatic moment when
Poland.
Exactly, when the foreign ministers flew off to Kiev and were there in the middle of the confrontation there in the Maidan. And I thought that was a very powerful moment in European diplomacy. I was perfectly comfortable when I saw that the Polish foreign minister was there. It could have been a Romanian foreign minister, it could have been a Polish foreign minister, a voice of Eastern Europe. The people who were most directly affected was there in those discussions. And it was a shame, although I think, it's been managed okay, nevertheless, it was a shame to lose that direct voice that represented some of the perspectives of newer members of the European Union and NATO who live closer to the issues that President Putin and the Russian leadership have provoked. In the case of France, I think I would just say that I think that characterization of French policy is a bit exaggeré.
I can argument. I can argument.
But I had enough discussions with senior people in the French government to know that because they live further away, the geopolitical challenge is not as immediate. It's not felt in their bones the same way. For them, sometimes I felt that I had to put a lot of emphasis on Ukraine and Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, because in the French perspective, and it's rooted in centuries of history, Paris, Moscow, Russia, France is obviously a deep relationship that dates back for centuries, sometimes a very conflictual relationship, needless to say.
As everything in Europe.
It's absolutely true. French business connections to Moscow are important. There are a number of wealthy Russian investors, oligarchs, I think the proper term, the scientific term, oligarchs.
Don't make them businessmen, please.
Russian oligarchs who have a lot of influence just by virtue of their business connections. So France, like a number of other European countries, has to try to find the right balance. I think something that was important, though, from President Hollande, Foreign Minister Fabius, I give him a great deal of credit because he's been very realistic in his appreciation and understanding of the situation and very determined to back Ukraine. So I think the French government, working in tandem with the Germans, perhaps with some input from other key allies, that might include the United States and Britain and other countries it works closely with, I think they've had the position they've needed to. They've played a positive role. So, but they are emblematic. Okay, I think they're emblematic of the challenges that a number of your European partners have in weighing the economic dimension against being determined in the face of this Russian aggression.
I disagree with you.
Well, that's okay. That's why we're having fun here in this discussion.
First, we are friends, and then and second, we work together in your mandate here. So I can afford not being an ambassador to disagree with you.
Right, but my advantage in this case is that from the moment that Russia took its first steps into Crimea, and throughout the spring and the summer, I was having those conversations. So inside the Élysée, inside the Quai d'Orsay, for sure, very intensive contact at different levels about how to proceed. And the French have been side by side with us and with your European partners on all the things that really mattered. And as time went on and they saw the limitations in trying to find a common dialogue with President Putin, they have gotten firmer. In the end, as far as the Mistrals go, the sale of the Mistrals, they recognized they didn't want to have to give up something economically that meant thousands of jobs.
Mr. Taplin,
thousands of jobs in France.
This is ironical. I mean, I agree with you that maybe they were on the same side of putting the economic sanctions and so on. But it's ironical that one founding father of European Union, and Europe, it's not only European Union, it's also Ukraine. I'm sorry to tell you that I disagree. I think France was not on the right side here, because not only that they should have been one of the pillars of defending, let's say, a country or Europe in front of Russia, but the attitude of France and Germany was always in this crisis, let's not upset Putin. If I will take the declarations of Mrs. Merkel and Hollande, Mr. Hollande was, as I was calling him, he was behaving more silent, but Mrs. Merkel was always saying, and I think she was speaking for both in a way, let's not upset Mr. Putin, let's find peace with Mr. Putin.
Right.
And in the meanwhile, people were dying. 260,000 people were taken out of their houses in Ukraine. 5 million people were affected. Putin was doing whatever he wanted in Ukraine. And that's why I'm saying, I mean, if it was a different country, I would understand. But France was a pillar of the European Union political project. So that's why I'm contradicting you, because we are a neighbor and we see the we see the danger here.
But you're not contradicting me, because that's, you know, also precisely my point. And that's why the role, Romania, Poland, and some of your other member states here, the Baltic states are smaller, they don't have the same weight, but they're influential in terms of raising consciousness within Europe and within the alliance. Those perspectives that might have been at play in Paris at the beginning of the crisis, very cautious, let's not do anything to escalate the situation. Over time, that has been changing. And the more that the Kremlin has not been responsible, has not lived up to the commitments that it made, right, to Chancellor Merkel and to President Hollande, I know for them and for their advisors, I think it was fine to hold out hope that a dialogue could be created, as long as you learn and recognize that there are limits and that you need to take these other steps that we've talked about. Support Ukraine more, okay? We all have to do more on behalf of Ukraine. That's the best response. Work through the alliance to upgrade our capabilities and keep the unity of diplomatic effort together. Those are the important things. Yeah.
My feeling was that until President Obama and the intervention of the United States was very firm 1 month ago, when the meeting with Donald Tusk and Merkel and Hollande took place. The big European countries we mentioned were not so decisive to stop Russia in Ukraine effectively. They were just playing, as you said, diplomatic and economic sanctions. But I think Obama was the one which really pushed it at the end. He understood the danger. He understood what everything was going on, that Putin doesn't care about the sanctions so much. And now we see a different attitude also from Europe. So that's why my view is that the United States actually changed a little bit the course of the European, big European countries. But let me ask you short and direct questions, and hopefully your short answers. How do you see the evolution of the big powers, of certain big powers now in the immediate future? How do you see the future of the United States?
Oh, our future? Well, we have the very happy set of circumstances that economically our recovery has continued. So in terms of where the United States is headed, I think that can give us a fair amount of confidence that we have the basis to continue to try to exert some positive leadership around the world. And of course, this Ukrainian crisis is a big part of that, but there are challenges in other parts of the world that we need to confront and deal with as well, some that are at least as complicated as the one involving Russia and Ukraine. If we were facing more serious economic challenges now, I think it might be a little bit harder, but I think that helps give an extra element of confidence compared to, say, it might have been the case in 2009.
China?
China, I think the Chinese are I'm not an expert on China, but I think the Chinese are looking at ways of strengthening their relationships around Asia. That's fine as long as it's done on a transparent, collegial, multilateral basis. Some of these confrontations, which at least as an outsider seem to be quite unnecessary with neighbors and other regional powers over, frankly, small sets of islands that otherwise haven't had much attention in human history, as far as I can tell. Those are the little areas for concern. But I think China has a destiny of being a major player. Of its economic strength alone should lead us in that direction. And hopefully, if the Chinese authorities can find a way to express that through their statecraft in a positive multilateral way where they're enhancing security in the Pacific region, not undermining
What about Russia?
Russia is a big concern. I think.
How do you see the future of it?
Yeah, the future of Russia is looks problematic because of the nature of, and I think unsustainable nature of its political organization. Obviously, there's some important structural economic challenges that would be there. The dependence that Russia has on, frankly, its energy exports. A lot of other measures of economic development, if we look back over the last 20 years, despite their favorable position, haven't gone so well. So if you put that on side by side with this fragility, there's a brittleness to the Russian political scene. We saw that most recently with all of the speculation about the 10 days, 9 days that President Putin was suddenly not visible. Absolutely. Look back at the speculation. We never would have had that kind of speculation.
And what is your opinion on that?
Well, my opinion is that I don't know what was going on. All I know is that because of the nature of the beast, the nature of the regime, dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, countries where there are limited opportunities for people to express their political views. Wherever Russia is on that spectrum, they are inherently fragile. And
what about
that's
the emerging big powers like India or Brazil?
Personally,
their future.
Personally, I think India is moving in a lot of very positive directions. And I think that as opposed to China to some extent, the economic growth and vitality in India is from the ground up. It's not centrally directed. It's actually coming from the base, and it may be more sustainable. Brazil still has some serious problems to confront, and we've seen this in the headlines recently. And there are issues that people in Eastern Europe are familiar with too: transparency, good governance, fighting official corruption. Brazil should be doing better. Brazil has made a lot of progress. It's an important country. I worked there for 3 years. But it should not always be, as Charles de Gaulle said, always the country of the future.
Now we'll take a short break for commercials. We'll be back.